Good evening and welcome. Tonight, I'm going to be reading to you from some history magazines. Tonight's articles were requested by my channel member, Hara Seza. So thank you so much for your choices of articles. And if you would like to pick an article for me to read, you can hit the join button right down there. My memberships are only 99 cents a month. There's no levels or tiers. It will never change the price. I've literally set it to as cheap as it can possibly be so that as many people can participate as possible. So, with that being said, we are going to read this really cool cover article about Gothic cathedrals and this article about the Cahokia Mounds. So since the theme for today is amazing man-made structures, I thought we'd start off with an article that I chose about this amazing temple complex. Can you believe this? This is not a painting. This is an actual photograph of Bagan in Myanmar. So let's learn more about it. Here we go. Trying to set it. I'm in my new apartment, new filming location, so everything's still getting used to. There we go. That's good enough. Soaring Buddhist temples of Bagan. For centuries, visitors to a bend of the Irrawaddy River in central Myanmar have been greeted with a breathtaking spectacle. Hundreds of rose-colored pagodas and temples rising above red soil and emerald-green vegetation. This vast sacred landscape is one of the largest concentrations of Buddhist temples anywhere in the world. Designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019, Bagan is the legacy of a complex relationship between religion and culture, whose role in the forging of Burmese identity would be explored by scholars in the early 1900s. Rapid rise. The name of the modern state of Myanmar and its previous name of Burma both derive from a people known either as the Mronma or the Burman. Historians believe the Burman originated in the lands bordering western China and Tibet. In the mid-9th century CE, the Burman swept south to occupy the lands of the Pew culture, then in military decline, establishing Bagan as their capital in the year 849. It was not a total conquest, however. The Pew had been shaped by cultural and economic ties with India. They practiced Buddhism, which the Burman newcomers adopted. Accustomed to the terrain and climate of much higher altitudes, the Burman also learned from the Pew wet rice agriculture that is still practiced in the Irrawaddy Delta. Bagan was a modest kingdom until 1044, when its greatest ruler, King Anurata, ascended the throne. His ascension heralded a major shift in the fortunes of Bagan and the region. The new king improved his kingdom's irrigation systems to make Bagan a major rice producer. He also laid ambitious military plans. In 1057, he captured the city of Taton, capital of the rich and cultured Mon kingdom to the south. Encouraging other Mon rulers to submit to Burman authority, Anurata rapidly united the whole Irrawaddy region under Bagan rule, creating the first Burmese empire. Anurata's achievement was as much about cultural exchange as military conquest. He fell under the influence of the Mon variety of Theravada Buddhism, and seeing this practice as a useful means of unification, the king promoted it across the Bagan realm. Building Bagan. Anurata also recognized the enormous value of Mon culture, which was steeped in Indian influences. Thanks to the wealth gained from conquering the Mon ports, Anurata could pay Mon artists, engineers, goldsmiths, and woodworkers to beautify Bagan. He commissioned countless stupas, pagodas, and temples, each one seemingly grander than the next. Following Anurata's death, Bagan's golden age rolled on, with buoyant trade paying for the fast expanding temple landscape. Sharing the fate of so many other states, Bagan power was eventually crushed under the onslaught of Mongol invasions. At first buoyed by victories, King Naratapati shunned diplomacy with Kublai Khan, leader of the Mongols. Bagan's luck changed, and a major defeat in 1277 at the Battle of Gasangyan was the beginning of the end. A decade later, Bagan fell. Although many of the temples and pagodas fell into disuse in the following centuries, Bagan resumed importance as a place of Buddhist pilgrimage in the 15th century. Its thousands of surviving monuments include temples, monasteries, and stupas, which, if you don't know, are structures which house Buddhist relics. They're shaped like mounds, bell-like domes, or cones. These sacred buildings are nearly all constructed of brick faced with stucco. Among the thousands of structures, from tiny one-room monasteries to sprawling temples, several landmarks stand out. The Lakhananda Pagoda, built by Anuradha, astonishes visitors with its gleaming dome, topped with an umbrella-shaped finial known as a khti. This pagoda contains a relic believed to be one of the Buddha's teeth. It was obtained by Anuradha in Sri Lanka. Finding the story. Bagan could not be discovered as it had been treasured by the Burmese for centuries. However, its history... let me go like this. This is the last page of the magazine. There we go. Its history was based on royal chronicles. The 18th century Mahayazawin and the 19th century Manan Yazawin. These accounts place the origins of Bagan in the very distant past and mix legends with verifiable history. In the early 1900s, Burmese scholars sought new data to provide more solid historical information on Bagan. Among these were Burmese scholar U Pe Mong Tin and the British academic Gordon Luce. After graduating in classics at Cambridge University, Luce taught literature in Rangoon, which is today Yangon, which was the capital of Burma. Today, Burma is known as Myanmar, and it's no longer the capital, when it was part of the British Empire. There, Luce befriended U Pe Mong Tin and a specialist in Pali, the sacred language of Theravada Buddhism. The friendship kindled Luce's passion for Burmese history. He spent much time at U Pe Mong Tin's home, where he fell in love with his sister, Metiti. The two married in 1915. In 1918, Luce published his first article on Bagan. 2 years later, when he applied for a professorship at Rangoon University, he was told by the British Chancellor that he had been excluded because of his marriage to a Burmese woman. Disappointed, Luce returned to Europe, where he continued his studies of Burmese history, language, and culture in Paris and London, where he studied Chinese. In 1923, he and U Pe Mong Tin collaborated on the first English translation of the Manan Yazawin. I think I'm going too fast. I need to slow down. Later, having returned to Rangoon, Luce concentrated on researching the Bagan Empire by compiling references to Bagan in medieval texts in Chinese. Combining this knowledge with his and U Pe Mong Tin's study of inscriptions at Bagan, both men set out to chart the history of Burma and of Bagan that is accepted today, that the Burmese originated in the 9th century CE with the Burman conquest of the Pew, and not centuries earlier as the chronicles claimed. Bagan has faced challenges in the 20th century. Restoration of the site by Myanmar's military government has been criticized by archaeologists. 2 earthquakes in 1975 and 2016 destroyed many structures. Specialists of Bagan history hope that the World Heritage designation will foster cooperation between specialists and the Myanmar government to preserve Bagan's sacred structures for years to come. I just think it's an absolutely gorgeous place. And this is the stupa that contains the relic of one of the Buddha's teeth. It's really fascinating. So let's get to our cover story here about Gothic cathedrals. Isn't that beautiful? Defying gravity. Now, just a note which I should have said in the beginning before I read about Bagan, but if I mispronounce anything, I'm terribly sorry. Feel free to correct me in the comments. Why don't I do this again? Still got to get used to my new desk and new filming setup. I think that works okay. Gothic cathedrals can often render spectators speechless, awestruck by dazzling stained glass, towering ceilings, and engineering marvels. Other visitors might be moved to eloquence, like American filmmaker Orson Welles. He once described France's Chartres Cathedral as this rich stone forest, this epic chant, this gaiety, this grand choiring shout of affirmation. Built between the 12th and 16th centuries, these soaring sacred spaces are among Europe's most popular tourist attractions today. From Notre Dame de Paris in France to Canterbury Cathedral in England, they attract people from all over the world to gaze at their intricate sculptures, pointed arches, and the marriage between light and air. The Gothic is perhaps Europe's most iconic style of Christian architecture. It first emerged in France in the 12th century and then spread across the continent. The Gothic is sometimes described as the ultimate expression of the medieval spirit, reflecting a society so fixed on heaven that it developed pointed arches and buttresses to aspire to the realm of God. While it is certainly true that a deep spiritual fervor inspired such projects, Gothic cathedrals were created by more mundane forces too. Taking centuries to complete, they required dedicated funding, political support, and a skilled labor force. How Gothic cathedrals were built tell historians not only about the organization of medieval societies, but also that these buildings were shaped by the character, economy, and available natural resources endemic to the places where they rose into the sky. Power and prestige. The term cathedral has evolved into a sort of catch-all descriptor for large grand churches. Its technical definition is a church that houses a cathedra, Latin for bishop's throne. One of Europe's first cathedrals is the 4th century Basilica di San Giovanni in Laterano in Rome, the seat of the Pope in his capacity as Bishop of Rome. Cathedrals not only were used to celebrate Christian rites, but also became hubs of political power during the Middle Ages. Inside the sacred space, there was also a fair amount of day-to-day governance going on. The chapter, formed by the canons or priests of the cathedral, would meet to discuss diocesan matters in the cathedral choir, a space that at other times was dedicated to prayer. They also managed the deduction of funds for the cathedral from the collection of rents and local taxes. Part of this money was also channeled back to the community in the form of improvements such as hospitals, roads, and bridges. In some ways, a cathedral was the medieval equivalent of a public forum. Merchants used cathedrals as places to meet clients and close deals. Guild members negotiated there. Shops and businesses sprang up along the outer walls, and the first university schools were housed within cathedral complexes. Members of the municipal council met in the cathedral, and justice was sometimes administered at its doors. Looks like they're getting some stone to build a cathedral there, aren't they? Gorgeous. That's in Saint-Denis. This role had been established long before the Gothic Age. Monumental stone-built cathedrals also predated the Gothic. These were built in the style known as Romanesque and emerged in the 11th century thanks to the wealth brought to European cities by the emergence of an extensive network of pilgrimage routes. The Gothic emerged from the Romanesque, which was distinctive for rounded arches, and relied on a different visual style developed in the Islamic world, pointed arches, which could bear more stress than the rounded. Employing this technique would allow walls to stretch even higher than before. Directing the gaze heavenward, the pointed arch helped emphasize the height of naves, and their use drove the development of another key feature of the Gothic, ribbed vaults in the ceiling. Flying buttresses are perhaps the Gothic's most iconic architectural advance. These structures are built on the outside of a cathedral and help distribute the weight of ceilings and upper structures. This in turn meant that cathedral walls could be thinner and penetrated by large glass windows, allowing more light and air inside the building. The building generally considered to be the first true Gothic structure is the Basilique Cathedrals de Saint-Denis near Paris, parts of which were completed in the mid-1100s. From there, the Gothic style spread through France, then Spain, Italy, Germany, the Low Countries, and England. Building these soaring churches took centuries. A craftsperson could begin work on the project and never live to see its completion. Construction of France's Notre-Dame de Paris took nearly 2 centuries, lasting from 1163 to 1345. In the German city of Cologne, the magnificent Gothic cathedral was begun in 1248. Its iconic twin spires were not completed until the 1800s, clocking in at more than 600 years later. The importance of place. Cathedrals arose for different reasons. Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain is believed to lie over the resting place of Saint James the Great, the patron saint of Spain. Other Gothic structures were built to house sacred treasures, such as Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which was commissioned by King Louis IX to hold holy relics from the Passion. A grand cathedral with strong sacred ties could attract pilgrims to a town, bringing in commerce and attention. Cathedrals were often built on top of older structures. Sometimes the intention was to send a message. In Spain, some cathedrals, such as the 13th century Cathedral of Toledo, were built over the site of mosques to hammer home the symbolism that Spain was now a Christian country. Other Gothic cathedrals were replacing older Christian structures. At Amiens in France, for example, the 13th century Gothic cathedral replaced the previous Romanesque structure, which had been destroyed by fire. After an 1174 fire destroyed the choir of England's Canterbury Cathedral, the damaged part of the building was rebuilt over the next decade in the Gothic style. An unusual example of a cathedral, there's Canterbury. An unusual example of a cathedral that was relocated to another site within the city is that of Segovia in Spain. In the 16th century, after the old cathedral was destroyed in a regional rebellion, a vast late Gothic structure was built in the former Jewish quarter, where, as a result of the recent expulsion of the Jews, land was available and affordable. The purchase and transportation of materials that cathedral construction entailed could bring wealth and strategic importance to cities. Begun in 1401, the Cathedral of Seville in Spain is the largest Gothic structure in the world. The church authorities set up a huge crane in Seville's river port to unload the blocks arriving from the quarry sited downriver near the coast. This crane became a source of income for the church, which rented the crane to other merchants, and a stimulus that helped turn the city into a naval and commercial power. Local resources also had a dramatic impact on the cathedral's outer appearance. The local availability of marble in Italy determined the look of many Italian cathedrals. The Gothic cathedral in Siena, for example, is faced in colored marble that provides a dramatic finish. Cathedral craftspeople. Behind the religious fervor that inspired the Gothic cathedrals, hard-headed realities had to be tackled to get these immense, often centuries-long building projects off the ground. Authorities had to recruit and manage engineers, artists, craftspeople, and laborers, as well as secure and transport the raw materials to the site. Bringing everything together and keeping the project running required a lot of political will and a lot of money. Romanesque architecture, which preceded the Gothic, could be built by large teams of relatively unskilled workers. Gothic construction, on the other hand, required smaller, well-trained groups of professional craftspeople. Enslaved laborers, usually prisoners of war, were sometimes employed. Most cathedral builders were adequately paid, and some even enjoyed privileges such as tax exemption. They were often provided with housing, and there are examples of workers organizing strikes and protests against low wages or poor conditions. Each working group was led by a master builder who acted as a primus inter pares, the first among equals. The master builder would be adept at the day-to-day practicalities, shaping the wedge-shaped stone block used to construct an arch or carving a relief. They also had to project manage, directing and coordinating the team. An experienced master builder might move away from hands-on work and instead give directions from the scaffolding, a habit that could provoke resentment. Shoulder to shoulder with the master builder worked another essential figure, the foreman, who maintained quality, kept the project on budget, and ensured deadlines were met. Up to a third of cathedral workers were women. Although they usually took on ancillary roles, beautiful, that's the Siena Cathedral. Ancillary roles, carrying materials or mixing mortar, there is some evidence of female master builders. In Cuenca, Spain, records show that a woman called Maria directed the stained glass workshop. In 13th century Strasbourg, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire and today in France, the sculptress Sabina von Steinbach is believed to have created the doorway of the city's cathedral, although some historians argue she may be legendary. Once the site had been chosen and cleared, the master builder measured and marked out the ground plan, and deep foundations were excavated. Although architectural plans were made in advance, the building process tended to be dynamic, with many cathedrals adapting and improvising around the original plans as new techniques became available. Sources show that when technical problems arose during the construction, the master builder would meet with officials to exchange ideas and decide how the work should proceed. Some of these conclaves are well documented, such as those that took place in Girona, Spain, where the audacious idea of trying to construct an extra-wide nave was raised and eventually adopted. It led to the building of the widest Gothic nave in the world. I think there's a picture of it right here. Yes. That does seem very wide, doesn't it? During construction of the Cathedral of Milan, Italy, numerous meetings were held in the 14th and 15th centuries to find engineering solutions to the ongoing works. Leonardo da Vinci himself presented some proposals. In Milan and elsewhere, architectural plans being used as a guide were not nearly as detailed as those of a modern-day architectural project, leaving many aspects open for discussion. The design process was solidly practical, based more on the use of compasses, set squares, and experience of what had worked in the past than on abstract calculation. Workers needed a whole battery of machinery and handheld tools to perform different specialized tasks, from carving detailed stonework to transporting and lifting heavy materials. Various technological advances were seen for the first time in Europe during this period, such as the rotating crane, the metal-wheeled carriage, various cutting machines, and the humble but game-changing wheelbarrow. Carpenters offered essential support in creating scaffolding and falsework, which is the wooden props that supported arches and vaults during construction. Damages and delays. Since many cathedrals sought to innovate with forms or structures that had never been attempted before, their builders had to take risks. Even though models or partial full-scale drawings called mounts were used, sometimes there was no way of knowing if a building was going to stay upright when scaffolding that provisionally supported roofs were removed. Some of the most daring structures did fall down or at least had to be reinforced. Domes, especially those topped with heavy lantern towers, you can see here, were particularly precarious. The naves themselves could get wobbly. Oh dear. Cologne, it's such a beautiful building, those big spires, could get wobbly when dimensions outstripped what could be supported by physics. In Beauvais, France, vaulting above the choir near the main altar collapsed at the end of the 13th century, after which it was necessary to double the number of pillars. As soon as the transept was finished, the project was halted and has never been completed. Workers in the Cathedral of Palma de Mallorca, Spain, which is almost as tall as that of Beauvais, came up with a system of counterweights under the roof that allowed the immense cathedral nave to be finished successfully. In Amiens, in northern France, a ring of side chapels was built to reinforce the huge central section of the cathedral. But even these were not enough. Master mason to the King of France, Pierre Tarcel, was brought in to add further reinforcement. Around 1500, he devised a solution that supports the church to this day, a wrought iron chain that encircles much of the cathedral. Often, ambitious plans were hampered by a lack of funds. It was common for building work on a cathedral to be halted before it was finished, because of budgetary rather than building problems. In southwest France, the Gothic Narbonne Cathedral was left half-built after the city entered a period of economic and political turmoil. Some half-finished cathedrals may give the jarring impression of a small, older church being swallowed within the jaws of a much larger, newer, unfinished one, as in the Beauvais Cathedral in France. In Siena, Italy, a massive extension planned for its nave was never completed, and its unfinished walls and arches still form part of the skyline. The classical spirit. The Gothic never penetrated Italy as much as other parts of Western Europe. With the advent of the Renaissance in the 15th century, Italy birthed a new style of cathedral building that would soon make the Gothic appear old-fashioned rather than innovative. Reflecting the humanistic tenor of the times, the new architecture placed a much greater emphasis on classicism. Looking back to classical architecture from Greece and Rome, pillars and domes became the defining features of a new Renaissance style. Churches, cathedrals, and other civic buildings turned away from the soaring dimensions of the Gothic, exalting more modestly proportioned structures. Times and styles changed, but the old Gothic structures still stood tall, and huge numbers of them still dominate Europe's cityscapes. The gravity-defying architectural feats of the period that built them were in some ways similar to the space race in modern times. Fraught with risk and demanding huge investment, cathedral building enabled European society to explore its limits, test its capabilities, and attempt to outperform its rivals. Isn't that an interesting article? It's really fascinating just how much work goes into those buildings. let's go much further back in time to this building. Not this. But, oh goodness. In biblical times, we're not going that far. Let me see. Where is this article? Here it is. America's first city, Cahokia, which this is what it looks like today. Let me go like this. There we go. East of the Mississippi River in southern Illinois lie the remains of an American Indian metropolis, the Cahokia Mounds. This urban center occupied nearly 4,000 acres during its peak between the years 1000 and 1200s. Cahokia's inhabitants built scores of burial mounds, public buildings, and even an astronomical observatory, Woodhenge, whose wood posts aligned with the sun throughout the year. Dominating the landscape then, as it does now, was Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork north of Mexico. Its 4 terraces soared about 100 feet high. Cahokia Mound stands at the center of what was once the greatest civilization between the deserts of Mexico and the North American Arctic. The site of one of North America's first cities and arguably one of American Indians' finest achievements. It is the most visible example left today of the Mississippian culture, an agricultural civilization that spread across the U.S. Midwest and Southeast, starting around the year 800 and peaking around the 13th century. Overlooked. Today, the site is an Illinois State Historic Site, a National Historic Landmark, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Nevertheless, until recently, it was largely familiar mostly to people around St. Louis, Missouri. That ignorance has deep roots. The first white person to have written a detailed account of Cahokia's mounds was Henry M. Brackenridge, a lawyer and amateur historian who came upon the site and its massive central mound while exploring the surrounding prairie in 1811. I was struck with the degree of astonishment, not unlike that which is experienced in contemplating the Egyptian pyramids. He wrote about the 100-plus mounds he counted. What a stupendous pile of earth! To heap up such a mass must have required years and the labors of thousands. Newspaper accounts of his discovery were widely ignored. Brackenridge complained about this in a letter to a friend, former President Thomas Jefferson. With friends in such high places, word of Cahokia did eventually get around. Unfortunately, it was not news that most Americans, including subsequent presidents, were particularly interested in hearing. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830, which ordered the relocation of Eastern Native Americans to land west of the Mississippi, was premised on the white supremacist notion that American Indians were savages, incapable of making good use of land. Evidence of a prehistoric city, or even larger than Washington, D.C. at the time, would have threatened that narrative. 19th century historians theorized that the mounds were built by an almost comic array of alternate peoples, Phoenicians, Vikings, or even perhaps a lost tribe of Israel, rather than acknowledge the skills and efforts of Native Americans. Even American universities took scant notice of Cahokia and other local sites before the second half of the 20th century. They preferred sending archaeologists to Greece, Mexico, and Egypt, where the stories of ancient civilizations were comfortably distant and romantic. Not until the 1880s did years of fieldwork by the Smithsonian Institution's Cyrus Thomas, originally a skeptic himself, definitively prove the mounds were of Native American origin. Still, relatively few people championed Cahokia and its neighboring mound centers in East St. Louis and St. Louis, once nicknamed Mound City, which fought a mostly losing battle against development, neglect, and treasure hunters for the better part of the century. Though Monk's Mound, named for French monks who once lived in its shadow, became a tiny state park in 1925, it was used for sledding and campgrounds. The rest of Cahokia was largely ignored, built on, and only sporadically studied until the 1960s. Ironically, the biggest construction project to tear into Cahokia would also put it on the map. President Dwight Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Program contained provisions for the study of archaeological sites in its path. This meant more money for excavations than had ever been available, as well as a clear agenda for where to dig, when, and how fast. With two highways slated to skewer the ancient city, I-55 and 70 now bisects Cahokia's North Plaza, creating a road sandwich with Collinsville Road, a quarter-mile to the south. Archaeologists began to study the site systematically. What they found was nothing less than revelatory. Birth of a city. It became apparent that Cahokia was more than just a stupendous pile of earth or an occasional meeting spot for scattered tribes. Nearly everywhere they dug, archaeologists found homes, indicating that thousands of people had once formed a community there, and many of their homes were built in a very brief span of time. Research revealed that the whole city seemed to have sprung to life almost overnight around 1050. People streamed in from surrounding areas, building houses and the infrastructure of a new city, including several mounds with buildings on top and a grand plaza the size of 45 football fields, used for everything from sporting events and communal feasts to religious celebrations. From the flat top of the colossal Monk's Mound, with a footprint of 14 acres, the mound is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Khufu. The view encompasses the vast floodplain known as the American Bottom. After directing the construction of what would have been the highest geographic feature in 175 square miles, a chief or high priest would have had a bird's-eye view of the land under his sway. That scenario presumes that Cahokia had such a single leader, which is not universally agreed upon. It is not even known what the site was called. The name Cahokia is borrowed from a tribe that lived nearby in the 1600s, or what the people who lived there called themselves. With no written language, they left behind a smattering of meager clues ripe for dispute. Despite the many points of contention among Cahokia scholars, there are still points of general consensus. Experts largely agree that the city quickly developed a couple centuries after corn became an important part of the local diet, that it drew together people from the American Bottom, and that it dwarfed other Mississippian communities in size and scope. Scholars tend to be divided on the size of its population, the nature of its government and economy, and the extent of the city's influence. At one extreme, there are descriptions of Cahokia as a theater of power, a hegemonic empire sustained by force that reached deep into the Mississippian world and perhaps connected to Mesoamerican civilizations such as the Maya or Toltec. At the other extreme are the characterizations of Cahokia as little more than an especially large Mississippian town. Less than 1% of the Cahokia site has been excavated, leading to speculation remaining in higher supply than evidence. Cahokia's demise is perhaps an even greater mystery than its emergence. By the 1400s, it was abandoned. The American Bottom and substantial parts of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys had become so depopulated they are referred to as the vacant quarter. Historians note that the city grew to prominence during an especially favorable climate phase and began shrinking around the time the climate became cooler, drier, and less predictable. For an agricultural community dependent on regular crop yields, the changing conditions could have been anything from stressful to catastrophic. The fact that between 1175 and 1275, Cahokia's inhabitants built and rebuilt several times a stockade encircling the city suggests that conflict, or the threat of conflict, was a regular part of life, perhaps because competition grew fierce. Furthermore, dense populations create environmental problems, pollution, disease, diminished resources that can be difficult to counter and that have brought down many societies. Recent excavations at the Cahokia site, led by geoarchaeologist Caitlin Rankin of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, suggest that the decline was most likely not caused by one single factor, like deforestation or flooding. Instead, archaeologists are exploring multiple possibilities as their work continues at North America's first city. You can see some archaeological work there. Pretty neat. And that's going to be it for tonight. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good